Okay, welcome back. I do want to make one acknowledgement here before we introduce the panel. As you could see in the film, a major, perhaps the single major force behind what happened here was the Haverford professor Bill Davidon, and as the film pointed out, he passed away in 2013. But you remember in the film there were a couple of snapshots of him with a little girl on his back at the protests, and that little girl is here with us today, Sarah Davidon. Would you please stand up? Let's acknowledge her. Thank you. So now we have the pleasure of meeting some of the stars of the film you just saw. Our first panelist is the guy who picked the lock, Keith Forsyth. Keith is an Ohio native who moved to Philadelphia in 1970, immediately became active in the movement against the war. He was later involved in community and union organizing, worked as a cab driver, stamping press operator, and an electrician before going back to school and becoming an engineer. He's still working for justice, working with the anti-gerrymandering organization called Fair Districts PA. Please welcome Keith. Next up is the remarkable woman who cased the joint before the burglary, Bonnie Raines. With her husband, John, who I had the pleasure to get to know as a Temple University professor. He passed away in 2017. She had a lifetime, has had a lifetime of working for social justice. Bonnie founded child care centers for Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, LaSalle University, establishing new standards for quality care for infants, toddlers, and preschoolers. She's coordinated the Picasso Project, which raises money for the arts in Philadelphia public schools. Please welcome Bonnie. Next is the journalist without whom we might never know any of this, Betty Medsger. Betty began her career at the Tribune Democrat in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, before coming to the Philadelphia Bulletin, where she first met John and Bonnie Raines. She then moved to the Washington Post, where she received this mysterious box of documents. She wouldn't know for more than 20 years where that box came from, and it took another 23 years until she was able to tell the world in her remarkable book, The Burglary, The Discovery of J. Edgar Hoover's Secret FBI. Betty is a highly respected journalist, an author of several books, and a journalism educator. I'm also proud to call her my friend. Please welcome Betty. Next, we have the woman who now needs no introduction, Joanna Hamilton. And our final panelist offers a unique perspective. Michael German served 16 years as an FBI special agent working in covert operations and domestic terrorism. He resigned in 2004 to report on problems inside the Bureau and began working as a lobbyist for the American Civil Liberties Union. He has taught courses on terrorism and civil liberties at the FBI National Academy, the National Defense University, and John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He, too, is an author and a lawyer. Please welcome Michael. And last but not least is my Temple University colleague, the man who will lead our discussion, Marc Lamont Hill. Marc is the Steve Charles Chair of Media, Cities, and Solutions at the Klein College of Media and Communication. He's also the host of Black News Tonight, a nightly program on the new Black News Channel. He grew up in Philly and has long been involved in social justice causes here and around the globe. He's the founder and director of the People's Education Center in North Philadelphia and the owner of Uncle Bobby's Coffee and Books. Ebony Magazine named him one of America's 100 most influential Black leaders. Please welcome Marc. look forward to a fascinating discussion.
Thank you, David. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for braving this storm. I didn't anticipate this. But it's so exciting. It's such an honor to be here with all of you. I have so many questions for each of you, but I'll start with the filmmaker. Joanna, why this film, why this story, and why at that moment?
You know, I had the great good fortune, and I mentioned a little bit of this in my introduction just now, Mark. I had the great good fortune to meet Betty when I came to the States. And Betty became an advisor to me as a journalism student at that point in time. But I personally had always been fascinated by this era, by the Vietnam War, me and several million other people. But I had always been intrigued by the role that journalists had played, in particular, during this time period. And when I met Betty, quite early on, she alluded to a book she was writing. And she would only tell me the very bare bones of the story. And a long story very short, over a period of years, I would say to her, you know, when you're ready to make the film, please let me know. And it took a few tries. I didn't know anything about the burglars, but I knew the outlines of the story. And you know, there are no better stories than telling the hidden histories. And in this case, something that had such a profound impact on America. The timing was hard to predict because, as I mentioned, it was an independently funded film, and many people said to me at the outset, we know about COINTELPRO. It's in history books. We know about COINTELPRO, and I was like, but we only know about COINTELPRO because of these people. When it did finally come out, it turns out that we were in the midst of the discussions around Edward Snowden's revelations. And so it felt that there was, not directly analogous, but there was some overlap. And it was very poignant, actually, because here were these, now at this point, in their later years, dealing with somebody who was very, very youthful. The discourse, when it came out in 2014, was quite something to behold. And whereas I had been concerned, and Betty and I had been concerned about how they would be received, we were incredibly gratified, obviously, that they were, by and large, incredibly well received.
Reasonably so. So now to these burglars. What makes someone use such or take such a risk? There's an ethic of risk that comes with any kind of activism. Something's always at stake. But you two on stage, and all 8 of you took the type of risk that most of us would never take, even if we believed in the same cause and were willing to make some sacrifice. I'll start with you, Bonnie. What made you feel like it was time to take that level of risk at that point in your life? You had so much to lose.
Well, my husband John and I did all of the things that we did to protest the war that were not making any difference. The war was worsening, and we began to realize that the administration and the military were lying to the public about the war, military casualties and civilian casualties, so that we became more and more frustrated, and particularly by the fact that no one in Washington was having any oversight over the surveillance of protests against the war at that time. And Hoover was in the driver's seat. And we knew he was everywhere in terms of trying to suppress dissent and intimidate. He wanted to crush the peace movement. He wanted to crush the Black empowerment movement. A lot of us knew that that was happening, but there was no way to get proof to take to the American people. Our main goal was to get the truth out to the American public. And there was only one way. We came to understand with the guidance of Bill Davidoff, our fearless, brilliant leader, there was only one way to document the abuses that were going on under Hoover's FBI, and that was to get actual, concrete documentation, objective documentation. And how would we do that? We would have to plan, it was Bill Davidoff's cagey and brilliant plan to target an FBI office in media, not the major government office in Center City, Philadelphia, but a smaller office that might be a little more vulnerable to a break-in and removal of their documents. And that began the planning process. When we were very meticulous, we didn't want to become martyrs. We really wanted to succeed, and we wanted to get the documentation that was necessary. And no one in Washington was going to hold Hoover accountable. So at times like that, it seemed to us that regular, ordinary citizens who maybe had a few ideas about how to pull off something like that and could join a small group of us who would trust each other and decide that we would take that risk and that it would be worth doing if the American public would come to realize the abuses of power.
There's a way, I mean, even when Bill talks about it, there's a way that, and I've heard other activists talk about this, they say, I'm assuming when I do this action that I may spend the rest of my life in prison. I'm assuming that my future will be determined, as he said, by the state. When you begin to do this, when you really begin to organize it to the point where you're thinking about how to pick the lock and not to drop things, have you conceded that your life may never be the same again in terms of being free? I mean, do you have to accept that you're not going to be free to do this, or do you just keep the blinders on and say, there's no way we'll fail?
So most of the people that were involved in this action had done more than just demonstrate before, including Bonnie, if you don't mind my saying so. Most of us had been involved in what is generally referred to as the Catholic left, although neither Bonnie nor I are Catholic, and breaking into draft boards to destroy records. So we had some experience of this kind of activity before. So it wasn't like this was the first illegal thing we ever did.
But this is like Ocean's 11 level, you know.
But I guess what I'm saying is that we felt like, you know, if you do this right, you have a reasonable chance of success. On the other hand, my personal philosophy was, even if you don't discount FBI, if you just keep breaking into draft boards in the middle of the night, sooner or later you're going to get caught. I mean, it's only a matter of time. But I think, so yeah, I think all of us were aware of that possibility, and even before I was an engineer, I think I had the engineer's mindset, so I bought some books about like how to do well in prison. Not really sure how helpful a book is about that, but it was worth a shot. But I think, seriously, on the subject of risk, when you think about it, I mean, think about the volunteer fireman in Gunquit, Maine, who runs into a burning house to save somebody he's never met, and the dude's not even getting paid. So people do risky things all the time if they think the goal is important enough. And one thing we were pretty sure of is that we weren't going to get killed. We were not going to get burned alive like the volunteer firemen. So, yeah, it was a risk, and I mean, frankly, for me, when you're 20 years old, what the hell do you really know, So, I'm thinking, oh yeah, well, I could go to jail for 40 years, whatever. But John and Bonnie had small children. I mean, that's hardcore.
That's super hardcore, but your point, you make a really great point, which is that you have to believe that the benefit of the action outweighs the risk that accompanies it.
Absolutely.
And the goal was to get the truth out. Mike, I'm going to go to you, because part of the truth that wanted to be out was this very complicated and messy history, and at that time, practice of the FBI. Now, I know this precedes you, of course, by a long time, but can you talk a little bit, even from your perspective, about sort of the way that the American people understood the FBI to function, which was without oversight and secretive, but in all of our best interests, and maybe coloring a little outside of the lines, and what was actually happening, which was a rogue organization undermining and compromising civil liberties, freedoms, et cetera, for a whole bunch of Americans. Help me think about that.
So I think part of it is, the FBI was created through executive fiat, right? Teddy Roosevelt wanted to create a body of investigators for the Justice Department to use on his progressive agenda, and Congress said, no, we don't want a spying agency in the United States. And so when Congress went out of session, he just did it anyway, and dared Congress to do anything once they came back, and happened to leak a little bit of information about some corruption among the congressmen who were opposing the creation of this body. So it was created in this unlawful sense and didn't have any laws governing it. So there were no internal guidelines that a conscientious FBI agent could turn to the guy engaging in abuses, and they were all guys then, and say, hey, you're breaking the rules, because there were no rules. And there was no direct oversight of the FBI in Congress, so they were operating in a completely lawless environment. And so that meant the person with the most aggressive attitude about identifying who the bad guys are and the most aggressive ideas about how to disrupt them didn't have any, there was no way to push back against that. And people forget, now when you talk about J. Edgar Hoover, you can hear everybody hiss. But the reason every president kept him during his 49-year tenure was because he was more popular publicly than they were. And they were afraid of trying to get rid of this guy who was a master at PR as much as he was a master in modernizing law enforcement. So you had this entity that people saw that was this shining attribute of the best of government, and it was impossible to chip it down. And that the information that proved what they were doing was wrong was sitting in an office in Media, Pennsylvania, waiting for a number of concerned citizens to do something incredibly brave.
Concerned citizens, and no bias here as a journalism professor, superhero journalists who
Right.
are the other piece of this amazing story. As a journalist, first of all, can you talk about what it means to get that kind of information sent to you? Like, what's your initial response, both as a journalist and as a human being, and what went through your mind? Because I can't imagine that there weren't competing or conflicting emotions, as well as the kind of professional impulse to get this stuff out. Talk to me about what that experience was like.
Well, my first concern was whether it was a hoax. The first files that I received, very first file that I read was the one that became emblematic of the burglary, the one about making people paranoid and make people think that there's an FBI agent behind every mailbox. And I thought that was a rather strange thing to write down if you were running such an agency. And thought there was a real chance that it was a hoax. So that was my first reaction. And I kept reading, and I'd only been in Washington by that time for a year and 3 months. I'd been here at the Evening Bulletin. But as I read, I started seeing the names of activists in Philadelphia whom I had covered. I mentioned a couple to you earlier, Paul Washington from the Church of the Advocate, Muhammad Kenyatta, and others. And so that made me think, well, maybe these are real documents. By the time I was done reading the first group, I was pretty convinced of that. There were some other extreme things that we certainly knew nothing about, and that was the massive surveillance of Black America. And that also seemed a little too extreme, despite everything that was happening against Black people by police departments, for instance, around that time, and against the Panthers, even though we didn't have any real idea of how much was being done against Black organizations, like setting one group against another, one individual against another. And there was a description of the surveillance involved every FBI agent in the country was required to hire someone as an informer who worked full-time on developing files for the FBI on Black people, not related to suspicion of crime, not related to past or suspicion of future violence, but just get as many files on as many Black people as possible with a description of where you can find them and so on. And this was all over the country. Every FBI agent was supposed to hire one person to do that, except in Washington, D.C., where every agent was instructed to hire 6 informers to work full-time on nothing but developing files. And these people would be monitored in the future, but files on Black people. And by the way, when the stories did appear, the paranoia document really hit the public. But the other thing was that this massive surveillance of Black people sounded very much like Stasi in East Germany. We were very much aware of the dreaded secret police in East Germany at that time and how the whole society felt that it was under surveillance. And indeed, we learned years later that was true. That was not paranoia. So by the time I was done reading all of that, I thought it probably was true, and therefore it was very important. I was young and innocent. I was relatively new to Washington, and so I was not part of the culture of Washington. What I realized later is that the instinct of getting secret FBI files would be to keep them secret. Now, that may seem strange today that would be the case, but we can talk later about the evidence of that. So my first reaction after I completed it was to go out to the national desk and to say that I had received this, and they were very surprised because they had just had a call from the Washington Post reporter who covered the FBI and worked out of the Justice Department press room, who wondered if anyone at the Post had received them. He knew that 2 members of Congress had received them and turned them in to the FBI. So they had me describe in some detail what the documents were. He went to the FBI, and the FBI said, yes, those are the files that we know that that's what other people received, and they were the ones that were stolen from media. So at that point, we had our confirmation of the authenticity of the files.
I want to pivot to Bonnie for a minute and then come back to you, because there's an interesting relationship here when there's a gross injustice and in the world, and it's like, who can you go to? Law enforcement isn't trustworthy. They're part of the people you're trying to put a spotlight on. The politicians may or may not help you. You go to 2 politicians, one Black, one white. Neither was helpful. The media, in some ways, turned out to be the savior for you. How much faith did you have when you're hatching this plan that the media would be the people to help you? And either of you can answer, but maybe start with Bonnie. Yeah.
Well, of course, we didn't know. By the time the documents had been distributed, we had no idea what the newspapers would decide. And we couldn't control that any longer, the process any longer. So we had to depend on the integrity of reporters and editors and owners of newspapers to see this.
A lot of sleepless nights, right?
Well, there's some integrity there. I continue to believe that. And certainly the Washington Post took responsibility for telling the truth. And it could have been at some real expense to them. And they were being threatened by the Attorney General. So we kind of held our breath, hoped that the investigative journalists would write the story and get it out there, not let it be buried on page 27 of the paper. And then there would be follow-up. We had to trust that that would stimulate the reaction in the American public and in other newspapers and reporting. And that's exactly what happened. So we did have a plan to send things to alternative press if we had to do that. And we did send some to the alternative.
What were some of the alternative presses you sent to?
Win was one of them, wasn't it?
So Win Magazine.
Win Magazine.
Published a large
Right,
files.
right.
And it's been too many years to remember the other names.
But Win Magazine, okay.
But that, the impact would have been quite different from the Washington Post putting it on the front page.
Oh yeah, please jump on in, Keith.
So yeah, I want to follow up on that, because really, to the extent that we made an impact, there was really two links in the chain. You know, what we did was one, but what the Post did was the other. So we sent the files to 3 mainstream newspapers that had, reputations for challenging the powerful to one degree or another: the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. And so, in my day, in high school civics class, we learned all about the ideal version of the freedom of the press and its watchdog role. But 2 of those 3 newspapers failed to publish. One because the FBI had an informant, correct me if I'm wrong, working for them, who intercepted the documents, and one for less clear reasons. So the Washington Post was the only mainstream newspaper that had the guts to publish this information when we first sent it out. So if they had decided to bury this, the only people that would have read about it were people who read the Rat or the Burning River News or Win Magazine, which in other words was, we've just been preaching to the choir. So in terms of any effect on the society as a whole, it really all came down, the Post carried the ball over the goalpost.
Talk to me about, can you talk a little bit about that? What propelled you and the paper to carry that ball over into the end zone? I mean, J. Edgar Hoover's reach didn't stop at newspapers. The FBI certainly was planting stories places, headlines places, etc. There's also the sense that, as you alluded to earlier, where sort of now journalists are much more willing to stand up and speak out and be whistleblowers, but there was also a sense of patriotism that many people had at the time to say, these are FBI files. We can't let this stuff get out. We have to protect our country, our national security. Even the 9th member, as you talked about, was terrified that perhaps there were some national security files that was going to cause him to turn you 2 in, and the other 6. What was the battle like for the Post to get that stuff out?
Well, I think what happened at each of the 3 papers that received them, it tells the story of what the culture of secrecy was like at the time. And each one is different. Each of the 3 is different. And Keith is right that there was an informer, but it was someone assigned to inform on a specific person. Jack Nelson was a very well-known investigative reporter at the time on the staff of the Los Angeles Times. And Jack, working with another journalist, Jack Bass, had written a couple stories that raised investigative stories that raised serious questions about Hoover's behavior in some things that had taken place in the South. And Hoover was so enraged by that that he immediately, this was about 2 years before the time of the burglary, that he started an extremely active campaign to have Jack Nelson fired. It even involved Hoover going to Los Angeles and meeting with the publisher at the LA Times, trying to get Jack fired. Jack didn't know much about the details of what was happening. Same thing in the Washington Bureau itself, tried to convince them to fire Jack, and to their great credit, they didn't do this. However, the FBI found a lower level editor at the Bureau who was willing to watch Jack's mail, open it, and that's what happened. Jack received the files, and this person opened them. Jack never knew he received the files and was as angry 20-some years later when I informed him after reading in the FBI files that this is what happened, as he would have been that day. And that person just immediately called the FBI and delivered the files to the FBI. What I'm telling you about both of the papers, I know because of reading the FBI investigation of the media burglary, which has a day-by-day report of what was happening in the investigation. So that's what happened at the Los Angeles Times. It just had to do with the fact that Hoover expected nothing but positive reporting, as Mike was discussing. The largest PR operation in any federal agent, second largest was Hoover's. The largest was the U.S. Marines. But his was massive, and it involved having staff members who ghost wrote books, ghost wrote magazines, articles, columns, even recipes for women's magazines. He had this image of himself, and it succeeded, that he was a beloved figure in American culture at all levels. Okay, moving on to the New York Times, what I discovered had happened there, Tom Wicker was a very well-known columnist at the New York Times, and he had written a few opinion pieces raising fairly mild questions about Hoover's FBI. But when Tom received the files, he thought to himself, as he said to his colleague Fred Graham, I'm a columnist, this is a reporting job, you cover the FBI here. And Fred Graham, who normally would be covering and writing stories, and we would think that this would be considered a pretty important one, looked at it and thought, these are secrets that deserve to be kept, and took them to the FBI. Now, again, at the Post, what happened was a very different thing. I was not somebody who was regularly covering the FBI. I had covered the wedding of a nun and priest who were part of the draft board raids the year before. And I remember knowing, and I'm pretty sure I must have written about this, that there were more wingtip shoes, FBI agents at the wedding than there were guests of the bride and groom. Family of the bride and groom. So that was pretty much the extent of my coverage of the FBI as of that time. But the real key to what happened at the Washington Post is Ben Bradley, but ultimately, of course, Katharine Graham. But this was the first time that Katharine Graham had been given the situation of having secret files that the government has demanded that she not publish. The FBI thought that because they confirmed that the files were authentic, we would say, oh, okay, they'll never see the light of day. And John Mitchell, the Attorney General, called Ben Bradley, the executive editor, and Katharine Graham repeatedly throughout that afternoon, demanding that they not be published. The in-house legal counsel recommended that they not be published, and Katharine Graham herself did not want to publish. Ben Bradley thought it was an important story, had the same attitude that I did. This is very important information that the public needs. We must write a story about this. By about 4 o'clock, the Attorney General had a pretty good idea that this might not go his way, and he put out a bulletin that was distributed by all the wires saying anybody who has copies of these files must turn them into the Justice Department immediately and not publish them, not make them public in any way. So I didn't know that this struggle was going on. And by the way, this is 3 months before the Pentagon Papers, so the issue really had not been dealt with by that time as to what do you do when you have these secret files that the government is trying to suppress. When I handed in my story at 6 o'clock in the afternoon, that was the first time that I had an inkling that it might not be published, ever. And I was quite surprised by that. But by 10 o'clock was the latest time that the decision to publish could be made. And after a struggle that had gone on all day, Katharine Graham decided at 10 o'clock that they would publish. And she deserves a lot of credit for it because, as you know about the Pentagon Papers, the paper was going through lots of legal circumstances and purchases of television stations that could have led the Nixon administration to happily suspend their licenses. One thing I would like to say, comparing then to today, when you wrote a story like this then, you could believe that the public would believe it. And even with Watergate, when it took a while sometimes, maybe months, for the public to believe something, I mean, there were people out there saying, I can't trust this, I can't trust the Washington Post, I don't think it's true. You could still think, because of the importance of facts and truth, that people would come around. And they always did. And I think often today about how different it must be for journalists and for the journalists throughout the years of the Trump administration who were called the enemy of the people, and their stories were called fake news, and pretty soon that caught on. And we have a certain percentage of the public that really doesn't believe. And I just think it must be a very different thing to work on this kind of story today than then.
Absolutely. Mike, I want to jump to you and Johanna for a minute, because as Betty's talking about the differences between then and now for journalism, there's some interesting then and now conversations to be had about both activism and also law enforcement. You know, Mike, you made much of your recent phase of your career talking about the FBI, talking about sort of how the FBI is responding to activism, to the conversations around terrorism or counterterrorism. Can you talk a little bit about what's different now and also what's not so different?
So the major thing that's different now is the vast changes in technology. And now the FBI has ways of leveraging that technological revolution in a manner that would have made J. Edgar Hoover blush, as far as the broad access to incredibly detailed information about all of our lives. What hasn't changed is the attitude of people in law enforcement when they're given the role of identifying proactively future threats, right? So, I worked most of my career on the criminal justice side of the FBI, but there was always a counterintelligence side of the FBI that, when I was coming up, was focused on Russian spies and, foreign hostile actors, where after 9/11, it became very clear that the FBI and the national security establishment thought the biggest threat was a fifth column, that Al-Qaeda had sleeper cells within the United States, and their main job as a proactive domestic intelligence agency was identifying the threat within. And, you still have a predominantly white male organization that when they look out on the horizon about who might become a threat, it doesn't look like me. right? Even though white supremacist violence has been a problem in the United States since there's been, even before there was the United States, that's something that seems like, noise over in the corner that we don't have to worry about because it's not something that threatens their communities and their families. And what they tend to look at is things that are different from them. And initially after 9/11, of course, the focus was on Muslim Arabs and people from the Middle East and South Asia, and that's where a lot of the focus was. But it instilled a training that we discovered when I was at the ACLU that was very Islamophobic and nativist. And security became homeland security, right? We protect the borders, we put up walls, we treat people who are coming to our country as a potential threat. And that nativism and that Islamophobia put a lot of law enforcement and the military in the same intellectual space with white supremacists. And I think that's where we're in a situation now where, because, as Betty said, our country is much more polarized, that we don't have a similar set of facts, right? That we're all operating from our own version of what the facts are. And so when these agencies are trying to determine the threat, they're not working objectively from evidence of criminal activity. They're working from, well, what would happen if those people did something bad? And that's an easy way to get away from targeting people who are actually committing harm and instead targeting people who are challenging the government in one way or another, or agitating for social change, or just immigrating to this country looking for a new start. And those people become the suspects that are then used, the potential threat. And of course, we're all potential threats, right? We could all go out and do something tomorrow, but they focus on the particular element that they think is the potential threat. And because their imagination is that the potential is so vast, that justifies using tools that you would only use against the worst actors in the world. And that's why during COINTELPRO, as the Church Committee said, they used tactics that were developed for the use of hostile foreign agents attacking our country against people who were simply agitating for civil rights and peace.
Joanna, you're a storyteller, and you told the story of that moment in that era masterfully. Again, this is a beautiful, beautiful film, powerful. When you tell the story, and I'm already giving you another job, but when you tell the story of this time period and what activism looks like and what the government response to activism looks like, what do you see as similar to this era? And
You're talking about today?
yes.
Well, I was just going to dovetail off what Mike said. I mean, I was so struck last year, and Mike can speak to this much more in depth, but by Bill Barr's response to the protests last summer. I mean, it felt very, very similar, right? They were starting to develop, I mean, Mike should really speak to this, but I was sort of transported back in time. I mean, I feel like we are a little bit, certainly since 9/11, struck by this feedback loop, this constant, when we go through these, it's cyclical, but, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, as Mike has just described, and then I feel again in the last 18 months or 2 years, I mean, the response to the protests last summer was so draconian. The things that were happening in Portland and various other countries where they were deploying police, was it FBI, without insignia, Department of Homeland Security, without insignia, snatching people off the streets. I mean, a sort of rendition come to the US. To your point about sort of then and now, I mean, what always struck me, and maybe it was something particular to this city as well, to Philadelphia, that they always spoke about, was that there were so many people who were involved, that in some senses they could blend in. Bob Williamson, I think, says it in the film, they could blend into the crowd in a way that may exist to a certain extent based on the sheer number of people who were on the streets last summer and ongoing. But I think it's infinitely more difficult now to simply blend in.
Absolutely. I think we have time for some, Dave, do we have time for some audience questions?
A few. We got quite a few, but we're going to just choose a couple of these to share with you. And the first one, I'm actually going to share a question, combine a question that I have with one from the audience. One of the best, wonderful anecdotes in Betty's book that wasn't included in the film, and I would hate to have people miss this because I think it's kind of magical. Is Betty, if you would talk about when you first learned who the burglars were and how, and then we'll move from that to a question from the audience for Keith and Bonnie on that question of deciding to reveal your identities and what went into that decision.
Oh, well, when I received the files from anonymous burglars, I had no idea who had sent them to me. And many years later, I had, in the interim, watched the aftermath unfold, see what they accomplished, and didn't think much about who they were. And then, many years later, after I had moved to California, I had a trip east, and I had known John and Bonnie when I lived in Philadelphia, and been a long time since I'd seen them. And so I made an appointment. I said I was coming to town. They invited me to dinner. And we had a lot to catch up on, and we were telling each other about our lives. And we were at the dinner table, and Mary, who was born after the burglary, and I did not know Mary. Mary came into the dining room to ask one of them a question, and as she was leaving, John said, "Mary, we want you to know, Betty, because many years ago, when your dad and mother had information about the FBI that we wanted the American public to know, we sent the files to Betty."
Blah, blah, blah.
And it was clear, Mary, I think, was 14 at the time and could not have cared less. And I couldn't wait until she left the room. And when she did, I said, are you telling me that you were media burglars? And they said yes. And my first thought was, you've got to be kidding me. My second thought was, how do I get this gaping mouth shut? And then after hours and hours of talking, as you can imagine, I had lots of questions. And they really opened up. And one of the things that they told me was that 10 days after the burglary, when they had their last session at that old farmhouse and were about to mail the first set of files, that they also had promised each other that they would take the secret of the burglary to their graves. And I left and went back to California and could think of little else from then on. And I got in touch with them, I think, about 2 weeks later and said, this is such an important story. You've accomplished a lot, but your motivation, the fact that you could do what you did, is extraordinary. And it's an important piece of American history. And I'd like to write a book. And I'd like for you to think about whether you'd like to cooperate with this. And then if you think it's a good idea, would you then set out to find the other burglars and ask them if they would reconsider that vow of secrecy? And fortunately, they were willing to do so. There was one that the question was never asked of because they never were able to find her, and I wasn't either. And then after the book came out and the film came out in early 2014, Judy Feingold, the missing burglar, got in touch. She was very upset because she took that vow very seriously. And they talked her into believing that this was a good thing, and she fortunately came around and thought the same. That's the story of how they
and
were.
that didn't happen overnight. I mean, we're talking in essentially 20-year intervals between when it happened, when you discovered, and then by the time the book came out.
Right.
So, Bonnie and Keith, talk about just that decision of breaking that vow and coming out.
Well, it really was a blabbermouth accident on the part of my husband. Maybe a little bit of pride at that moment, too, of the importance of the event. And it just, after thinking long and hard about it, we decided that it was a pretty important story that should get out to the American public, particularly about what an average, ordinary citizen might be able to accomplish to write something that was really, really wrong, and that it might even get people thinking about what might they do in their lives to stand up to something that was wrong. We were also part of a community of resistance that was very important to us at the time, and I think we hoped that people also would think, if the story was told in the right way, and we knew Betty would do that, that it might inspire people to look for their own communities of value and resistance to empower them as citizens. So it was time for the story to be told, and we had no idea that it would have the impact that it had, but apparently it stimulated people's thinking about taking some bold steps, in some cases, to protect our democracy.
Wonderful. And Keith?
Yeah, I mean, I had the same considerations. And, I think the only thing I could add is to say, just from a personal point of view, the first thing I wanted to know was, what does Bonnie and John and Bill think? And they all thought it was a good idea, so that was the first step. So I thought about it seriously, and I had the same considerations Bonnie had. I'm like, you know what? Maybe this would be a good conversation. And there's so much of real history that, never really gets written down. The winners write the history, as they say. Boy, is that true. So that was a consideration. And I also thought, really, there's really no risk anymore. I mean, it's been so long. Does anybody really care? And, my kids are grown and gone. My house is paid off. So, what the hell can they really do to me? So it wasn't really that big of a risk. But, the main consideration was, I think, just as Bonnie said, we weren't trying to, it was not our intention to brag, look at us, look how great we are. It was just, these are important issues. They've always been important issues. They always will be important issues. There's always going to be a conflict between authority and freedom, and that's a conversation that will never end.
I have to say, if there were a Best Actor category for documentaries, you definitely would have won that. You were amazing. This is a good one. What advice would you give to young people today in regards to ensuring accountability of our government? And I hearken to one of your colleagues there talked about how much more cynical our country is today than it was then, and we certainly want, and Mark and I talk about this with our students. We want them to be skeptical, absolutely, but we don't want them to be cynical. So, what advice, any of you, do you have for them?
I'm going to jump in on this one. The main thing that I would say, and this is, a person, right? I don't have any special expertise here, is that don't give up on the people who don't agree with you. You know, it's a big country. All of us there's a lot of differences from one person to another. And don't just preach to the choir. You know, preach to the sinners. And actually preach is not a good choice of words. You know, try to engage people. And, you know, it's not easy. It's, you know, incredibly frustrating and annoying and depressing sometimes to do that, but and more often than not, you don't get most of what you want, but once in a while you get some of it, and that's how we move forward.
Wonderful. Well, I'm afraid we're at the time. I think all of us who live in this community, you know, it was a wonderful piece of serendipity that you guys happened to pick this town to raid. But I think it's also very fitting because the sort of conversation that Keith just talked about, it happens here. I mean, this really is a wonderful community where people really do talk and listen to each other. And as you can see, even on a night with tornado warnings, they come out to learn. So please join me in thanking this wonderful group of people. Get home safely.